It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I set off for my weekend camping trip in the heart of England's Lake District. The year was 2023, and I had just turned 28. I'd been looking forward to this break for weeks. Life had been hectic, work had been demanding, and I just needed some solitude to clear my head. I had spent months searching for the perfect campsite, away from the usual tourist spots, somewhere isolated where I could connect with nature. I arrived at a secluded site on the outskirts of a small village, surrounded by towering pine trees and rolling hills. The trail leading to the campsite was narrow and barely marked, winding through the dense forest. I was alone, with no other campers in sight. The silence was almost unsettling at first, but it was the kind of peace I craved. I unloaded my gear from the car, my trusty old tent, sleeping bag, stove, and a couple of cans of beans for food. The weather was overcast but calm, and I could tell it would be cold as the evening approached. After setting up camp, I took a walk around the area, exploring the woods. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, the fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. The air had a crispness to it, and the scent of pine needles filled my nostrils. Despite the beauty, there was something off. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt like I was being watched. I chalked it up to the eeriness of the woods and pushed the thought aside, focusing on the tranquility of the place. As I returned to my campsite, I began to prepare dinner. The simple act of boiling water for some instant noodles calmed my nerves, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, the first real stars of the night began to appear. The crackling of the fire added to the peaceful atmosphere, and I felt a sense of contentment. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect, maybe, but then the quiet was broken. A soft rustling came from the trees behind my camp. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the noise didn't stop. It wasn't the natural rustle of an animal scurrying through the leaves. It was too deliberate. A branch snapped, and I froze, my hand instinctively going for the small pocket knife in my jacket pocket. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my heart raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I stood still, waiting, listening. The rustling continued, growing closer, and then nothing, complete silence. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Still, I resumed my dinner, occasionally glancing around the camp, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But there was no one, just the distant sounds of the forest. The fire crackled, its orange glow dancing in the otherwise dark surroundings. I ate quickly, eager to finish before the cold set in fully. The temperature had already dropped considerably, and the dampness in the air made the chill even worse. I climbed into my tent after cleaning up, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The rustling outside was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but it didn't feel like just wind. It felt like something was out there, waiting. I turned over in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, staring at the faint outlines of my gear through the dark. The hours dragged on, and every noise seemed to pull me deeper into a sense of dread. I had almost convinced myself that I was being paranoid when I heard it again, this time closer than before. A slow, deliberate step. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but it was unmistakable. My heart started to pound, and I lay there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. The sound of someone or something was now unmistakable, stepping through the underbrush outside my tent. My hand gripped the knife tightly, my knuckles white, but I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through every possible scenario, and none of them seemed good. The steps stopped just outside the tent. My pulse hammered in my ears as I held my breath, straining to hear. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, The minutes felt like hours. My mind kept racing, but my body was paralyzed with fear. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping loudly in the silence, drowning out the rest of the world. I didn't dare move a muscle, not even to adjust my grip on the knife. The sounds from outside were muffled, but I could tell whoever or whatever was there wasn't leaving. The weight of their presence was suffocating. I stayed that way for what felt like an eternity. The wind had picked up again, but the noises outside were still there, lingering, just on the other side of the tent. I couldn't help myself anymore. I had to know what it was. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper of the tent. My hands were clammy, shaking with fear, but I forced myself to move. The sound of the zipper seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. As the flap of the tent parted just slightly, I pushed it open a little more, sticking my head out into the cold night air. The fire was little more than a few glowing embers now, casting long shadows against the trees. The night felt unusually still, the wind no longer howling through the branches. And then I saw it. There, standing near the edge of my campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure. A person, tall and thin, dressed in dark, weathered clothes. They stood motionless, facing away from me, but I could sense their presence, feel their eyes on me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see their face, but I could make out the shape of them, their posture, the way they seemed to blend into the darkness. I couldn't tell how long I had been staring, but eventually, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk away from the camp. No quick movements, no rush, just a slow, methodical retreat into the forest. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. The moment I saw it start to walk away, I scrambled out of the tent and grabbed my flashlight. My heart was still pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I was terrified, but I had to know who or what was out there. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I didn't dare call out, didn't dare make a sound. The figure was moving farther now, but not fast, almost like it was waiting for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the overwhelming fear of what I might find and the deep, gnawing curiosity that urged me forward. I decided to follow. The figure moved farther into the woods, and I kept my distance, trying to stay hidden behind the trees. The underbrush crunched beneath my boots as I carefully navigated through the forest. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of the figure up ahead, their shape barely visible in the low light. They didn't seem to be in any hurry, as if they knew I was following but didn't mind. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that I realized how far I had followed. The figure stopped in the center of the clearing, facing away from me. My breath was ragged, and I was covered in a cold sweat, but I had to know who this person was. I took one step forward, then another, and then I saw it. The figure turned around slowly, and in that moment, I froze. The face that stared back at me was gaunt, pale, and hollow-eyed. It was a face I didn't recognize, but somehow it felt familiar, disturbingly familiar. And then it smiled. The smile was not comforting. It wasn't friendly. It was a twisted, unsettling expression that sent a chill down my spine. I took another step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, smiling that terrible smile. It was almost as if it was daring me to approach. I turned around quickly, my body acting on instinct. I ran back toward my camp as fast as I could, my feet stumbling over rocks and twigs. My breath was ragged, my mind unable to process what I had just seen. All I could think of was getting back to the safety of my tent, locking myself in, and never leaving. But even as I ran, I could still feel that smile, that gaze, haunting me from the darkness. When I finally reached my camp, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag, and started to pack up. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care how late it was or how cold it had become. I wasn't going to risk staying another minute in the woods. I was terrified, utterly terrified, and I knew I couldn't spend another night there. It took me almost an hour to pack everything up, my hands shaking uncontrollably the entire time. I had never been more scared in my life. But eventually, I got everything into my car and slammed the door shut. Without a second thought, I started the engine and drove away, not looking back once. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small inn to stay the night. The relief I felt when I saw the warm lights of the inn was overwhelming. I checked into a room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. I never did find out who or what the figure in the woods was, but one thing was certain. I would never go camping alone again, not in that part of England, and not ever again. The memory of that face and that smile would stay with me for the rest of my life. I learned that some parts of the world are better left unexplored. And as I finally fell asleep that night, exhausted but safe, I could only hope that whatever it was out there would never come for me again. I'd been planning this trip for months, the sort of thing I'd done before. A quiet escape from the daily grind. It had been a while since I'd taken a break from the city. Too long, really. This time, though, I was going solo. I had been craving some solitude and, truth be told, the idea of being away from people for a few days felt like exactly what I needed. I decided to head up to a remote spot in the mountains just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm 32, and I'm used to hiking and camping alone, but this would be different, a bit more isolated. The place I picked, White Bear Canyon, wasn't a spot most people knew about. My friend had told me about it, but when I asked around, no one else seemed to know it. Perfect. No tourists, no rangers, just me and the wilderness. The drive there was beautiful, the sort of scenic route where every corner revealed something new. A hidden stream, towering cliffs, the smell of pines and the crispness of the mountain air. I left my phone in the car when I parked, as I always did on trips like this. It didn't make sense to have it with me out here. I set up camp in a small, clear area near the edge of a ridge, just off the trail. There was a fire ring already in place, an old one, but it looked usable enough. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I quickly unpacked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and some food. Nothing fancy. I knew the drill. The mountain air was growing cooler, and the fire crackled as I got it going. I settled down for the evening, roasting some sausages over the flames and enjoying the solitude. I didn't feel scared, but I was aware of the silence. It was different than the sort of silence you get in a city or even in a quiet town. Out here, there's an unsettling quality to the quiet. It's a heavy silence filled with the sounds of nature that are easy to ignore when you're not paying attention. The wind rustling the leaves, the occasional chirp of a distant bird, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But otherwise, it was silent. As the night deepened, I lay in my tent listening to the crackling fire outside. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway in a way that reminded me of how fragile everything really was. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. The fire had long since burned down, and with it, the usual sounds of the wilderness took over. I heard a branch snap in the distance. That was normal. It was probably just a deer or something else making its way through the woods. But then I heard another snap closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. A few minutes later, I heard something else. A soft, crunching noise coming from just beyond the fire ring. It was as though someone or something was walking in the darkness, stepping carefully over the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too cautious. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound, but the forest had gone completely still again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Slowly, I let the tension ease from my body and rolled back over. It was probably just some camper or a hiker passing through the area. No big deal. But the moment I began to relax, the noise came again. Closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when I swept it around the campsite, I saw nothing. Not a single thing moving. I shone it over the trail that led away from the fire pit, but it was empty, the path snaking off into the trees. Still, that feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I lay back down, my mind racing. There had to be someone out there. Maybe another camper who didn't have a fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the way that made sense. I managed to fall asleep eventually, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I kept waking up, hearing the occasional snap of a twig, the distant rush of wind through the pines. Each time, I would hold my breath, hoping it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. At first light, I was awake and on edge. The air was still cool, the morning mist hanging low among the trees. I packed up my tent and gear quickly, wanting to be ready in case I needed to leave. But part of me, some primal part of me, was telling me to stay. I could make it through one more night, surely. And maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking it. I decided to go for a hike. The morning light bathed the canyon in a soft, golden glow, and the sounds of birds and the wind calmed my nerves a bit. The forest felt more normal during the day, full of life and movement. I didn't hear anything strange, nothing that made me uneasy. But as I made my way up a trail toward a higher ridge, I saw something that made my stomach turn. I couldn't describe it properly at first, the thing I saw. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a person. It was just wrong. A pile of discarded things, like someone had been living there but had left in a hurry. It was too clean for it to be natural. I found old clothes, torn fabric that looked like it had been ripped from something, a tarp half buried under some pine needles. No campfire, no tools, nothing that looked like it belonged in the wild. It felt out of place in a way I couldn't explain. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The pile was strange, as though someone had carefully hidden it. And then, as I moved even closer, I saw a small wooden box, wedged into the dirt. I didn't touch it. The gut feeling inside me told me not to. I wasn't about to open something that had been left there like that. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. Something wasn't right about this. I had no proof of anything, no evidence, but the feeling that had been gnawing at me since the night before was back. There was someone else out here, someone who didn't want to be found. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the unease creeping back into my bones. The hike was nice, the air cool, the trees tall and imposing, but there was that box in the woods, that abandoned spot, and it lingered in my mind. I didn't want to think about it too much, but the thought of being watched or followed kept me alert. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low again, casting long shadows on the ground. I decided to start a fire and settle in for the night. But as I prepared the kindling, something else hit me. An odd sensation, like someone was standing just behind me, watching. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the stress was getting to me. I had no reason to be afraid. But still, the shadows seemed darker, the wind colder. Something in my gut told me that I wasn't alone out here. That night, I stayed awake. I didn't even bother to try sleeping. I kept my eyes on the trail, the trees, the dark spaces between the trunks. Hours passed and still nothing happened. But the tension kept building. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. the footsteps, careful and slow, coming closer. I froze, listening intently. This time, they were unmistakable. Someone was out there. They were just beyond my camp, moving slowly, trying to stay hidden. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sound, but once again, I saw nothing. My pulse quickened, but I refused to let fear take over. I had to stay calm. The noise stopped, and then there was nothing. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not daring to close my eyes. At first light, I packed up my things quickly, no longer caring about being quiet. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to leave. I didn't waste any time heading back down the trail to my car. I was done. As I reached my car, I felt the tension finally leave my body. There was no one behind me. No one had followed me. But that feeling, that primal, unshakable feeling, never really went away. There was something I had missed, something I didn't understand. But I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I never went back to White Bear Canyon. And as I drove away, leaving the forest behind me, I felt like I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. Something that might have been waiting for me all along. It was early October, and the forest air had that crisp chill to it, the kind of chill that settles deep into your bones when you're not used to it. I had taken the weekend off to get away from the noise of city life, the pressure of work, and the weight of everything I was dealing with in my personal life. So, when I came across a small, off-the-beaten-path cemetery, the idea of camping there seemed like a strange but oddly appealing idea. No one would be around, and it would be the perfect place to think and clear my head. Or so I thought. The place was tucked into the corner of a small, rundown town in West Virginia, a place I never expected to find myself in. The cemetery had been abandoned for years, from what I could tell. The old iron gate that once secured the grounds was bent and rusted, and the path leading to it was overgrown with wild grass, weeds, and stray trees that had started to take over the area. But there was something about it that intrigued me. Maybe it was the solitude or the challenge of setting up camp in such an eerie place. I drove my beat-up truck down the narrow, unpaved road, which led to the cemetery. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing old gravestones sticking out at odd angles from the ground, their surfaces weathered and eroded by time. I parked by the entrance and sat for a minute, taking it all in. The area felt strangely calm, too calm almost. The distant sound of rustling leaves in the wind made the whole place feel like it was breathing. After grabbing my gear from the truck, I made my way past the broken gate. The air smelled of damp earth, mixed with the faint scent of decay that seemed to linger everywhere in the woods. I set up my tent in a small clearing near the far corner of the cemetery, where the stones were oldest, their markings barely legible. I figured it was far enough away from the main entrance, where I wouldn't feel like I was too close to the crumbling graves. I didn't know why, but something about the place felt off. I kept hearing noises, but nothing I could pinpoint. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling through the trees or knocking against the gravestones. But as the night wore on, I started to wonder if maybe I was just trying to convince myself that it was nothing. The sounds came in waves, sometimes a branch snapping, other times what sounded like footsteps far off in the distance. The night grew darker, and the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. I tried to ignore the unease settling in my chest, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I lay back in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes kept darting around the cemetery, trying to make sense of the shadows dancing across the graves. I finally closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, reached my ears. My heart raced, and my mind scrambled to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, or perhaps someone else had wandered into the cemetery. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just the wind, the branches, something natural. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat up in my tent, my breath shallow, trying to calm myself. The footsteps were closer now. My eyes scanned the edges of the graveyard, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the endless rows of gravestones. I debated whether I should get out and investigate, but my instincts told me to stay put. I didn't want to risk finding something that could explain the noise, something I wouldn't be able to forget once I saw it. The noise stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the entire cemetery fell into a kind of eerie silence. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining to catch any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, I heard it again, a soft scrape against the ground, followed by a faint rustling. This time, it was unmistakable. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the gravestones I had avoided setting up camp near. My mind raced. Was someone walking through the cemetery? A hunter? A wanderer? Or something else? I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and shining it toward the noise. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the graves in front of me. Shadows stretched out, playing tricks with my mind. The wind howled, and for a split second, I thought I saw something or someone moving between the graves. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape slipping between the stones, almost like it was trying to stay hidden. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The figure was gone in an instant, leaving me with nothing but the darkness and the sound of my own racing pulse. I thought about calling out, but what if it wasn't just someone passing through? What if it was someone who had no business being here? Someone who was trying to find me? The thought made my blood run cold. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't dare move. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Something was watching me, waiting. I had no idea how much time passed, but every creak of the trees, every rustle in the underbrush, made me jump. I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. As I lay there, too scared to sleep, I started to hear something else. A low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground. At first, I thought it was just an animal digging, but then it grew louder, almost like something or someone was dragging themselves across the dirt. The noise stopped, but the feeling of dread only intensified. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. My instincts were screaming at me to pack up and leave, but the fear held me in place. Eventually, the morning light began to creep over the horizon. The shadows of the cemetery stretched long across the ground as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The eerie silence that had consumed the night began to lift, and the world around me slowly started to feel more normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something I hadn't seen, but something that had been too close. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I folded the tent and stuffed it into my bag. The footsteps, the dragging noise, everything still lingered in my mind. When I got back to my truck and drove away from the cemetery, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time. There was nothing behind me, no figure lurking in the graveyard, no one waiting in the shadows, just the wind, the trees, and the old gravestones. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to understand. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I didn't have to. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I would never go back to that cemetery, and I would never go camping alone in a place like that again. Some places are better left undisturbed, forgotten by time, and I had learned that lesson the hard way. As I drove away, the town faded in my rearview mirror, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never forget that night in the graveyard. It had changed something in me. I wasn't sure what I had encountered, but I knew I didn't ever want to find out. My name's Matt. I was 32 when this happened. I was living in Denver back then, working long hours as a freelance web developer. That summer had been brutal for my mental health. Deadlines piling up, client calls dragging past midnight, junk food dinners, and my sleep schedule in shambles. I hadn't taken a break in almost a year, so when I saw a last-minute opening on a backcountry camping permit site for a remote spot in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado, I didn't hesitate. Booked it right away. 5 days, for nights, completely off-grid, just what I needed to reset. The area was in a national forest, not an official campground. No running water, no cell service, no ranger station nearby. You had to park about 6 miles from the nearest paved road, hike another 3 or 4 miles past the trailhead, and then you were on your own. It wasn't technically illegal to camp there, just rarely visited, since it required effort and had 0 facilities. I left on a Tuesday morning in late August 2017. I took my old Subaru Outback, packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, bear spray, water filter, solar charger, compass, map, even a cheap emergency radio. I wasn't new to this. I'd done solo camping trips before, though usually in places a little closer to civilization. This was my first time going completely alone, completely off-grid. The drive took almost 7 hours. The last stretch was a dusty Forest Service road barely wide enough for 2 cars. I didn't pass another vehicle for miles. I parked in the tiny pull-off near the marked but mostly overgrown trailhead around 4 p.m. I hiked until a little after 6 p.m. The sun dipped behind the mountain ridges, and I found a flat clearing just above a stream with a decent view of the valley below. It looked perfect, secluded, quiet, peaceful. I pitched my tent, made dinner, and sat with my back against a tree watching the colors change in the sky. The first night was normal, chilly but calm. I slept straight through. I didn't set up a campfire because I was too tired and didn't want to draw attention to smoke in such a dry area. I had a small camping stove for heating water and relied on my headlamp after dark. The second day, I explored a few rocky outcrops and followed the stream uphill. I spotted some deer, some fox tracks, and a hawk circling above a ridge. It felt good to breathe air that didn't smell like car exhaust or leftover pizza. I didn't see or hear another soul. My boots got soaked at one point crossing a deeper part of the stream, but I laid them out in the sun for a few hours and they dried enough to wear by the evening. Again, no problems. The trouble started on day 3. That morning, I woke up to find a rock had been placed just outside my tent zipper. Not a natural formation, not a rock that just rolled down a slope. A smooth river stone, about the size of my palm, laid perfectly on top of a flat leaf. I just stared at it for a few seconds, still groggy. I'd zipped the tent shut the night before, had no food left outside, no reason for any animal to be snooping around. It unsettled me. I scanned the area for footprints. Nothing obvious. The soil was dry and hard-packed. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was part of a game some backpacker left behind. Maybe it fell out of my bag somehow and landed just like that. It didn't make any sense, but I didn't want to admit that someone or something had been close to my tent while I slept. I moved it aside and didn't think about it again for a few hours. That day I did some journaling, took a nap in the afternoon, and hiked up to a ledge overlooking a canyon about an hour before sunset. I brought a peanut butter sandwich and a can of warm beer I'd buried in the stream the day before. I sat on the ledge, legs dangling, soaking it in. It was honestly the most at peace I'd felt in months. But when I got back to my tent, something was off. The zipper wasn't where I'd left it. I always zipped it to the bottom left corner. I remembered doing it before I left, but now it was on the top right side, about a third of the way down. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stepped closer. The flaps were still sealed, but the line in the dirt where the zipper had pressed into the ground was different. It had definitely been opened and closed. I stood there frozen for a solid minute. Then I unzipped it and looked inside. Everything was there: my sleeping bag, my gear, my pack, my jacket. Nothing missing. Nothing seemed moved, but someone had opened it. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay with the bear spray in my hand and the emergency radio next to my head. I kept the zipper closed tight and placed a small pile of twigs just outside the tent entrance. If someone came near, I'd hear the crackle. At least I hoped I would. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard movement outside. Slow, careful footsteps. I held my breath. Couldn't be sure. It might have been wind, or a deer, or my own mind unraveling. I didn't open the zipper to check. I just lay there, heart hammering, every little sound amplified in the darkness. When I finally fell asleep near dawn, I dreamed I was being watched through the trees. That feeling stuck with me the rest of the day. Day 4, I decided to cut the trip short. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a gut instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. I packed up camp around noon and hiked halfway back to the trailhead. I didn't want to reach my car too early and have to drive in the dark, so I set up a temporary camp a few miles out from the lot, just to rest and leave early the next morning. The new spot was less scenic, close to a bend in the trail with no view, but I didn't care. I wanted out. That evening, I made the mistake of checking my gear again. I realized something subtle had changed. One of the side pockets in my pack was open. Inside, the zipper had been fully undone and re-zipped the wrong way. Again, something I never do. I always zip from left to right. Inside the pocket, my water filter and my backup compass. Both were there, but the compass had been turned upside down and tucked into a mesh sleeve. The filter was damp, as if someone had tested it. I felt cold all over, not from the air, but from the realization that someone had been inside my pack. Someone had touched my things. Someone had watched me go off, then gone through my stuff while I was away. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat with my back against a tree a few yards from my tent and waited. The forest was so quiet it buzzed in my ears. I kept thinking I saw movement at the edge of the trees, quick flashes between trunks. But every time I stood up to check, nothing. Around 3 a.m., I finally heard it. Twigs snapping. Deliberate, slow steps. Not random crunches, not wind. Someone was walking nearby. Then silence. Then a whisper of movement again. I switched off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree. My heart thudded so loud I felt it in my neck. The steps got closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes on me. That horrible, unmistakable pressure of being watched. Then nothing. After several minutes, I crept back to my gear, stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could, and started hiking. I didn't wait for sunrise. I didn't bother packing the tent. I left it behind. I just wanted out. The trail back to the car was a blur. I didn't run exactly, but I didn't stop either. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. Every bend in the path felt like a trap. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But no one did. When I reached the car just after 7 a.m., the first thing I noticed was that the driver's side door handle was wet, like it had been touched recently. There had been no rain or dew. I checked the lock, still sealed, nothing missing from inside. But it chilled me. I got in, locked the doors, and drove for nearly 2 hours before I stopped. Only when I reached a gas station in a small town called Ure did I finally let myself breathe again. I never reported it. What would I say? Someone left a rock outside my tent and moved my compass? There were no signs of assault, no stolen items, nothing technically illegal. Just signs, warnings. presence, pattern. I've never been camping alone since. And sometimes, I still wake up thinking I hear twigs snapping just outside my window. I was 31 that year, living in Arkansas, working as a forklift operator for a warehouse near Fayetteville. I'd just come off a long stretch of 6-day weeks. Most of my time was eaten up by work and sleep. I needed something to feel like I had some control over my time again. So I took a Friday off and made a plan to head out Thursday evening for a solo camping trip in the Ozarks, northwest of a place called Ork. I picked out a spot from a map a coworker mentioned once. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing off a long-forgotten Forest Service road. I figured the fewer people around, the better. I wasn't looking for company. I wanted quiet, nature, and time alone. I packed light but enough. My tent, a decent sleeping bag, a tarp, a hatchet, a flashlight, a folding knife, 2 lighters, and enough food for 3 days. I also had a basic first aid kit and an old GPS unit. The drive out took about 2.5 hours through winding roads and soft rain that had started mid-afternoon. By the time I left the paved highway for the dirt path, the rain had thickened. It wasn't a downpour, just steady and heavy enough to soak you through if you stood out in it long. The Forest Service road I'd turned onto had seen better days. Potholes filled with muddy water, brush closing in from both sides, and the occasional rock slide that looked like it had been there for years without anyone clearing it. I had an older 4Runner, the kind that still had some steel under it, so I trusted it to get me through. Took another 45 minutes crawling through that mess before I found the clearing. It was maybe 40 feet wide and shaped like an oval, surrounded by tall trees on every side. You couldn't see the sky unless you looked straight up. A good place to be alone, a bad place to get in trouble. I set up quickly. The rain wasn't letting up, and the light was dying behind the clouds fast. I got the tent up, laid the tarp beneath it, and made sure everything inside was dry. My backpack stayed under the small awning of the tent. I knew from past trips to keep the food sealed and high, so I hung the food sack on a tree about 20 yards from camp. I didn't want raccoons sniffing around. I hadn't seen a soul since turning off the highway. No other vehicles.
No hikers.
Nothing but birds and wet trees. The night came fast, and the rain got heavier. I sat in the tent listening to it for a while, watching the inside of the nylon darken as clouds thickened. The sound was calming at first, like white noise, but it didn't stay that way. Around 9 or so, I thought I heard something under the sound of rain. Not loud, just movement, a branch cracking, leaves shifting, something light, not like a deer, more like a person walking slow. I stopped breathing for a second to listen. The rain wasn't loud enough to drown everything out, and sure enough, I heard it again. Something moving past the tent, maybe 15 or 20 feet out. Could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe a fox or a feral hog, but it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too spaced out. Even through the rain, I could feel the rhythm of footsteps. I reached for the hatchet. It was just inside the tent flap. I stayed still, not breathing, just holding the handle tight and waiting. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The rain kept falling, steady and hard, but nothing else moved. Eventually, I talked myself down. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the wind had dropped something from a tree. I made sure everything was zipped and latched, turned off the flashlight, and tried to sleep. It was a rough night. Every time I started to drift off, a gust of wind or heavier rain would snap me back. My mind wouldn't stop turning. What if someone had followed me up here? What if they'd parked somewhere and hiked in? What if they were out there watching the tent? I'd left no trace on the road in, but the tracks behind my SUV would have been easy to follow if someone came in after me. By 3 a.m., I was still wide awake. The inside of the tent was humid and cold at the same time, and my sleeping bag was starting to feel clammy. I hadn't heard any more footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again, closer this time, a sharp, dry snap of a stick, not blown by wind, stepped on. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. This time I knew it wasn't just in my head. The sound came from behind the tent, opposite the direction I'd hung the food. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Then I slowly reached down and unzipped the side pocket of my bag, pulling out the flashlight without making much noise. I flipped it on and clicked it to red mode, less visible from a distance. I unzipped the front of the tent an inch, just enough to peek out. My breath fogged the small gap. I scanned the tree line. Nothing but shadow and branches dripping rain. But there was something wrong. There were no animal sounds anymore. The night bugs, frogs, the far-off owl I'd heard earlier, all of it had stopped. That silence hit harder than anything else. Felt intentional, like the forest was warning me. I slid back inside, zipped the flap, and waited. The rain kept falling, heavier now. The roof of the tent sagged in spots where water was pooling. I checked my watch, 4:12 a.m. That's when I saw it. A small silhouette moving past the tent on the left side. Close, no more than 6 feet away. I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't an animal. It was upright, human-shaped. It moved slow, almost carefully, like it was trying not to be noticed. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. My fingers tightened around the hatchet, and I held the flashlight, ready to swing it on. But I didn't move. If they didn't know I was awake, I wanted to keep it that way. The shape paused near the front of the tent, just outside the awning. And then it kept walking, slow, deliberate steps fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until full daylight before I moved. By the time the sun filtered through the trees, the rain had dropped to a misty drizzle. Everything was soaked, but I didn't care. I got out of the tent with the hatchet in hand and circled the clearing. No footprints, just mud. But near the tree line, I found something. A small cigarette, but half buried in the wet leaves. Still fresh, still smelled faintly of tobacco. I don't smoke. No one had any reason to be up there but me. I packed everything in 15 minutes. Sloppy, rushed. I didn't care. I shoved the wet tent into its sack and jammed it into the back of the SUV. I didn't bother checking to see if I left anything. I just wanted out. That forest, which had felt peaceful the evening before, now felt like it was closing in. The drive out felt longer than the way in. Every branch that scraped the side of the truck made me jump. Every puddle made me check the mirrors. I kept thinking I'd see someone in the rear view, some figure standing in the middle of the road, but I didn't. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I drove all the way back to Fayetteville, parked in my lot, and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. I never went back to that spot. I never even looked it up again. I didn't report it. Who would I report it to? I didn't see a crime. I just saw something I wasn't meant to. Someone wandering around a remote forest during a rainy night. Maybe they were harmless. Maybe they were looking for shelter. But my gut told me something else. Told me someone had followed me. And they didn't want me to know they were there. But they did want to get close. Too close. I was 32 when my boss invited me on a weekend camping trip in Central Oregon. It was late October 2021, and the weather had started to turn. The leaves were orange and red, and the air had that heavy, earthy smell I always associated with rain. I worked at a mid-sized logistics company just outside of Eugene, and my boss, Mark Holloway, was one of those outdoorsy types, tall, lean, always wearing hiking boots even to staff meetings. I wasn't close with him, but I guess I'd said yes one too many times when he talked about hunting and backpacking. When he asked if I wanted to tag along for a 2-night camping trip out near the Cascades, I didn't want to seem soft, so I said sure. We left early on a Friday morning. Mark picked me up in his silver Tacoma just before 6. I brought a sleeping bag, a borrowed tent, a backpack, and some extra layers. He had all the real gear: big coolers, a heavy-duty camp stove, bear canisters, and a duffel stuffed with supplies that made mine look like I was packing for a backyard sleepover. Still, he seemed glad to have the company. We drove east for nearly 4 hours, winding through mountain roads and dense pine forests. We finally pulled off a gravel road about 30 miles from La Pine, down a narrow path that looked more like a deer trail than something meant for vehicles. We bounced and scraped our way deep into the trees until Mark decided we'd gone far enough. The spot was remote. No cell service, no power lines, nothing but trees in every direction. There was a small clearing with just enough flat ground for 2 tents. A creek ran nearby, barely moving but loud enough to mask smaller sounds in the forest. It was quiet in that way only deep woods can be, still and muted like the trees were listening. We set up camp. My tent leaned a little to the left, but it held. Mark's was a sleek 4-season dome with extra rain protection. He had a folding table, a camp chair, and a big cast iron skillet. He cooked us bacon and eggs over a small fire, and we drank instant coffee from mismatched mugs. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was about elk migration, weather patterns, and elevation gains. I mostly listened and nodded. That afternoon, we hiked up a ridge to get a view of the valley. It was beautiful, pines stretching forever, snow just starting to dust the mountain tops. On the way back, Mark pointed out scat and tracks, talking about what they meant. I wasn't used to walking in silence for hours, but he seemed to prefer it that way. Back at camp, the sun dropped fast behind the trees, and the cold came with it. We layered up, started another fire, and cooked hot dogs on sticks like kids. The stars came out, so bright and close it felt like you could touch them. That night, I didn't sleep much. The ground was hard, and every rustle outside made my heart thump. I heard footsteps more than once, but I told myself it was deer. The second day was colder. We woke up to frost on the tent flaps. Mark made oatmeal and strong coffee, then told me we'd do a longer hike, up along a ridge that looped around and dropped back into the clearing from the other side. It was supposed to be 8 miles, give or take. I brought water and a protein bar. Mark carried a sidearm, a map, and his GPS tracker. The first few miles were fine. The trail was overgrown but visible. We climbed steadily, the trees thinning out as we gained elevation. By mid-morning, the sun came out, and it warmed up enough that I took off my outer shell. Mark stayed ahead most of the time, walking with that quiet, confident step of someone who knew exactly where he was. I didn't. Around mile 6, we stopped to eat. Mark checked the GPS, squinted at the sky, and said we should push on quickly. Clouds were moving in. Sure enough, the weather started to shift. The sky darkened, and wind picked up from the north. By the time we started descending, it was raining. Not hard, but steady enough to soak my jacket. The trail disappeared in places, swallowed by fallen branches and underbrush. We didn't talk much. I could feel Mark getting tense. He kept checking the GPS and the compass clipped to his vest. At one point, he stopped walking and just stared at the ground, frowning. I asked if we were off trail. He didn't say anything, just looked around, then kept moving. That's when I first got uneasy. The descent took longer than I expected. The creek that was supposed to lead back to camp wasn't where it should have been, and the terrain was unfamiliar. More than once, we doubled back, walking in slow circles through wet underbrush and cold mud. The light faded, and the temperature dropped. Eventually, Mark stopped completely. He was breathing hard, staring at the GPS. Then he turned it off and shoved it in his vest. I followed him a few more minutes until he finally admitted we weren't where we were supposed to be. We made camp under a cluster of trees using a tarp and some nylon rope Mark kept in his bag. I was soaked, shivering, and scared in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Mark made a fire with wet wood, somehow getting it to smoke and hiss enough to warm our hands. We ate cold beans and shared the last of the jerky. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. There were sounds, not loud ones, just the kind you notice when everything else goes quiet. Wet leaves being stepped on, sticks cracking, breathing maybe. At one point, I was sure someone was standing just outside the tarp, watching. I didn't move, just waited for the sound to go away. In the morning, we started walking again. Mark tried to hide it, but I could tell he was panicking. He moved faster, didn't explain anything, just marched through thick brush, over ridges, and across shallow creeks. My legs ached. My feet were blistered. The rain hadn't let up, and everything I wore was soaked. We hadn't seen another human being in almost 2 days. Midday, we found a broken trail marker, just a weathered wooden stake with faded red paint. Mark studied it for a long time, then decided to follow what might have been a trail. It curved east, then dropped into a valley that felt too steep. We slid more than walked, grabbing at wet branches and slippery rocks to slow our fall. At the bottom, we came across something strange. A campsite, but not ours. It looked abandoned, but recently. There was a fire ring, a tarp tied between 2 trees, and some garbage stuffed in a plastic bag. Empty cans, a burnt glove, some fishing line tangled around a branch. Felt wrong, like someone had left in a hurry. Mark didn't want to stay. He grabbed his pack and pushed forward, moving faster. I kept glancing back at the site until the trees swallowed it again. By late afternoon, we hit another creek. This one was bigger, and it curved north toward a rock formation Mark remembered seeing on a map. He looked more hopeful. We followed the water for hours, slipping on wet stones, soaked to the bone. Just before dark, we stumbled into a familiar spot, a bend in the creek that we'd crossed on the first day. From there, it was another mile to the camp. I didn't believe it until I saw Mark's truck parked between the trees. We made it back just as it got too dark to see without a flashlight. The fire pit was wet and cold. My tent had collapsed. One of the corners had been trampled by something heavy. Maybe an elk, maybe not. Mark checked his tent and froze. The zipper had been ripped open, not unzipped. Torn like someone had taken a knife to it. His duffel bag was open, supplies scattered. His sidearm was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't speak either. Just sat near the fire pit, not lit, listening to the trees creak and moan. I kept thinking about the abandoned camp we passed, about the sounds in the woods, and the missing sidearm. Mark didn't move, didn't blink much, just stared into the darkness with his back against a tree. First light, we packed fast. No food, no cleanup. Just grabbed what we could and stuffed it into the truck. Mark drove faster than I'd ever seen someone drive on that narrow trail. Branches slapped the windshield, mud sprayed the sides, and we didn't stop until we were back on the paved road. I didn't go back to work the next week. Called out sick. Mark never followed up. A few days later, I handed in my notice. I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. We weren't just lost. Someone had been near our camp, maybe watching us the whole time. I think about that night. The ripped tent, the missing gun, the sounds in the woods, and I know we weren't alone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found our way back that day. If we'd stayed one more night. I don't go camping anymore. Not in remote places, not with anyone I don't know well. And I never, ever talk about that trip out loud. But I remember it. Every step, every sound, every second. It was early fall when I decided to take a break from my hectic life and go camping in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Ben, and I'm 31 years old. I had been working nonstop at a tech firm in Seattle for the last few years, and the pressure had been building. I needed a break. I needed something to reset my mind. The idea of being alone, surrounded by trees and the sound of the wind, felt like the right way to recharge. I planned my trip carefully. No one knew where I was going, and I liked it that way. Just a few miles south of Mount Rainier, there was a small, mostly deserted campsite I found online, tucked deep into the woods, away from the crowded national parks. It wasn't exactly an official campground, the type of place people stumbled upon by accident or knew about because of word of mouth. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, and of course my rifle just in case. I wasn't particularly worried about wildlife. Bears were rare in this part of the forest, but it was always better to be prepared. I got on the road early in the morning, eager to get to the site before sunset. The drive was smooth, a little over 2 hours on winding roads. The trees grew denser the further I went, and the air started to smell fresher, richer with the scent of pine and earth. By late afternoon, I had arrived at the site. I parked my old truck on the gravel patch and walked around for a bit, scouting out the area. The campsite itself was in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with a creek running nearby. It was beautiful, quiet, exactly what I needed. There were no other vehicles around, and I hadn't passed anyone for miles. I set up camp, lit a small fire, and spent the rest of the evening relaxing, listening to the sounds of the forest. By nightfall, the woods were pitch black. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I had everything I needed. No phone, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. It was peaceful, but there was something about it that made me feel a little uneasy. Something in the air that I couldn't quite place. Could have been the isolation. It had been so long since I'd spent time alone out here. I'd only been sitting by the fire for about an hour when I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, just a rustle of leaves off in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of life after all. But the sound came again. This time it was closer. My heart rate picked up a little, but I didn't let it show. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that your mind can start playing tricks on you in the dark. Still, I found myself glancing around, my eyes scanning the edges of the camp. Nothing. I went back to the fire, but the rustling continued, now a little more persistent. It wasn't the random noises of small animals anymore. It was heavier, like something was moving around deliberately, circling the campsite. My gut told me it wasn't a bear. Bears aren't that quiet. They crash through the brush, making their presence known. This was different. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows against the trees. I could almost feel the presence, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My hand instinctively went to the rifle by my side. I'd never used it before, but it was a comfort to have. I sat there for a while, unmoving, listening. I wanted to believe it was just a curious animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, but deep down I wasn't sure. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, pointing it toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the underbrush, but it revealed nothing. I turned back to the campfire. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was human-shaped, tall, but bent at an odd angle. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen for a moment, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but it felt real, too real. The shadow moved again, disappearing into the trees. I quickly grabbed the rifle and backed toward the truck, my eyes darting around. There was no way it could have been a person out here. The nearest town was at least 30 miles away. The rustling continued, this time coming from the left, closer to the creek. I was no longer sitting comfortably by the fire. I was alert, every nerve in my body on edge. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I had to make sure I wasn't being hunted, that I wasn't the prey in this situation. I started moving cautiously toward the truck, the flashlight and rifle raised, scanning the dark. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the woods to the right. A branch snapped in a way that could only mean something or someone was moving quickly through the forest. I spun around, aiming my flashlight and rifle in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what was out there, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to find out. My heart raced as I made my decision. I wasn't staying here another night. I was getting out. I grabbed my gear and started packing quickly, my hands shaking with adrenaline. As I loaded everything into the truck, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves in the distance. They were getting closer. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, speeding out of the campsite, my headlights cutting through the dark forest. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I drove fast, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone or something pursuing me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dark trees passing by in the light of my headlights. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where I felt a bit safer, surrounded by other drivers and civilization. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there. I couldn't explain it. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but this time felt different. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? It sounded insane. Who would believe it? A shadow in the woods, footsteps at the edge of camp, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't enough for the cops to investigate or for anyone to take me seriously. But I knew the truth. I wasn't alone out there, and that fact made me realize something even more chilling. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were still watching. I was 28 when it happened. The year was 2017. I had just left my job at a small shipping warehouse on the west end of Pine Ridge, Arkansas. I'd been working there almost 5 years, and though the pay was okay, I'd gotten tired of the long hours and backbreaking labor. I needed a break, needed to breathe a little. After handing in my resignation, I didn't tell many people. I wasn't really close with anyone anyway, not since college. I didn't have a girlfriend. My family was scattered and I didn't talk to most of them. I kept to myself, which made things easier. After quitting, I had this idea to go camping. Just me out in the woods. I'd always found the quiet helpful. A way to reset things. No phones, no traffic, no people. I wanted isolation. Not the dramatic kind where people find themselves. Just peace. I started planning right away, even though I was no expert outdoorsman. I picked a place I'd never been before. A patch of forest near a place called Trenton's Wash, a few hours east of Little Rock. I found it online through a forum where people shared remote camping spots. It was technically public land, though not marked for regular use. No campsites, no paved roads, no bathrooms. The closest town was more than 30 miles away. That was the appeal. I loaded up my old Ford Ranger with gear, a secondhand tent, an army-style sleeping bag, some propane cans, a little stove, dehydrated food, water containers, and a solar charger for emergencies. I brought my old .22 rifle too, locked in a case. It wasn't meant for protection, just habit. My dad had taught me how to shoot when I was younger, and I always felt better having it around. The first day went fine. I drove down back roads that turned into gravel, then dirt, then something barely passable. The final stretch I walked, hauling my gear on foot. I found a flat clearing near a dry creek bed. It was surrounded by tall pines and brush, nothing special, but it was private. I pitched my tent there, set up a basic perimeter with stones, and stacked some firewood I gathered nearby. That night, I made simple food, drank a couple beers I'd brought in my cooler, and stared at the stars until I fell asleep. The second day was just as peaceful. I hiked in the area, kept track of landmarks with my compass, and marked trees with bits of red tape so I wouldn't get lost. It was warm during the day, cooler at night, but I was comfortable. I didn't see a single person or hear anything unnatural. That's what I'd come for. It was on the third day that I noticed something odd. I woke up around 7 a.m. to find the firewood I'd stacked neatly beside the pit was gone. Not disturbed, just gone. The ring of stones I'd set to mark the fire boundary was also changed. Someone had moved them into a circle about 5 feet away. At first, I figured maybe an animal did it, but rocks don't get moved by raccoons. And the firewood was just gone. Not scattered, not chewed or broken, just not there anymore. I looked around the campsite. Nothing else seemed touched. My gear was intact. My food was fine. The tent was undisturbed, but it shook me a little. I made a mental note of it and spent most of that day gathering new wood and walking the nearby tree lines to see if I saw signs of anyone. I didn't. Still, I kept the rifle a little closer that night. The next morning, I found footprints near my tent. Not boot prints, regular sneakers. They were faint in the dry soil, but definitely fresh. I checked my gear again, still untouched, but whoever came had walked right up to my tent, circled it, and walked away. That was enough. I packed some of my things that day, intending to leave the following morning. I didn't want to walk back to the truck in the dark, and I didn't want to move camp late and risk getting hurt. I'd just make it one more night and get out early. I barely slept that night. Every little sound felt too loud. At one point, I thought I saw a light between the trees, but it was gone before I could focus on it. At dawn, I broke camp. I packed everything quickly and set out toward where I left the truck. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, loaded now. The trip back took longer than I remembered. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't relaxed either. When I finally reached the dirt road, I saw it. My truck was gone. At first, I thought I'd walked the wrong way. I double-checked my tape markers, walked the stretch 3 times, but it was the right spot. The grass where it had sat was still flattened. The tire tracks were there, but the truck was gone. No note, no signs of a tow, just missing. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes trying to process what to do. I had no cell signal, of course. I was miles from town. I'd seen no people for days. My only option was to start walking west and hope to find someone. That walk took hours. I rationed water and food, rested in shade when I found it. I stayed near the dirt road, hoping someone would drive by, but no one came, not even a distant engine. Around late afternoon, the sun started bearing down hard. I began to feel the edges of heat exhaustion. I remember sitting against a rock outcropping, head spinning, and thinking I might just pass out. Then I saw the truck. Not mine, a police truck. A white Dodge Ram with county decals. Came around a bend in the road behind me. I stood and waved. The driver slowed, then stopped about 20 feet away. I was relieved, a little confused why he didn't roll closer, but I was too drained to care. I waved again. He got out slowly. He was in full uniform. Tan shirt, badge, wide brim hat, dark sunglasses. He looked like a regular small-town cop, middle-aged, maybe late 40s. He didn't say anything, just stood by the door of the truck and watched me. I took a step forward, hands up slightly, trying to show I wasn't a threat. That's when I realized I still had the rifle slung on my shoulder. I reached up slowly to unclip it and lay it down, but the cop stepped back and drew his weapon. Not fast, methodical, calm. I stopped moving. My heart started pounding. I tried to show him with my hands that I was putting the rifle down, just letting it slide off my shoulder. He shouted something, but I couldn't make it out. He was too far. The wind picked up, and my ears were still ringing from the heat. I dropped the rifle to the dirt and stepped back. My hands stayed open, high. Then he fired. The first shot hit my side. I dropped instantly. The wind knocked from me. Pain exploded up through my ribs, burning and sharp. I tried to roll, but I couldn't. My limbs wouldn't respond right. I saw blood in the dust. I heard another shot, then another. I felt a burning in my chest, then nothing in my legs. The sky was blue. I remember that clearly. Big, cloudless blue. He walked toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He stood over me for a long time, breathing hard. Then he knelt and picked up the rifle. He wiped it with something from his pocket, then set it beside me, close to my hand. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. I laid there for hours. My body wouldn't move. I couldn't feel anything from my stomach down. I tried to yell, but my lungs were collapsing. I tasted blood. My vision got blurry, then dark, then came back for a few seconds. Over and over. When the sun went down, I thought I saw headlights in the distance again. I thought someone was coming to help, but I died before they ever reached me. Later, they said I pointed a rifle at him. That was the story in the paper. Man in woods with firearm acts aggressively, shot in self-defense. That was the headline. My name was buried in the 4th paragraph. No mention of the missing truck. No mention of the footprints or the firewood or how I tried to walk out and get help. My body was recovered the next morning by a forestry crew doing seasonal burn checks. They called it justified. The cop was placed on leave for 2 weeks. Then he was back on duty. No one looked deeper. No one asked why a man would be shot while dehydrated and defenseless with his rifle in the dirt. The official statement said I was acting erratically, said I refused to drop the weapon. They said the shooting was clean. That was it. That's how it ended. I just wanted to camp. I just wanted quiet. I didn't break any laws. I didn't threaten anyone. I tried to leave. I tried to surrender. But I died alone in the dust because I looked like a problem to someone holding a badge and a gun. And now I'm just a name in a story no one will remember. It was October of 2019 when I made one of the dumbest decisions of my life. I was 27 back then, living in a small town called Arden Falls in Missouri. I'd grown up there, so I knew the back roads, the trails behind the ridge, the forgotten paths people didn't bother with anymore. Arden Falls had a population under 2,000, and like a lot of towns that small, there wasn't much to do. Most nights were quiet, just the wind sliding through trees and the distant sound of trucks cutting through the dark. I was going through a rough patch. I'd lost my job at the lumber yard after some restructuring, and I'd been drinking too much, wasting money on gas, driving around back roads just to feel like I wasn't stuck. My mom had passed a year before, and my dad had moved out to Oklahoma, remarried, and was starting a whole new life. I didn't have much holding me down except my own inertia. I felt like I was just rotting slowly in place, and there was this itching feeling in me that made me do something that didn't make a whole lot of sense. That's how I ended up deciding to go camping in an old graveyard outside of town. The place was called Jennings Hill Cemetery. It was about a 35-minute drive east of Arden Falls. No one went out there. The county stopped maintaining it back in the early 2000s. All the folks buried there had passed in the 1800s, maybe a few in the early 1900s, but most families either moved away or died off and nobody visited anymore. It was tucked in this little clearing off a narrow gravel road, and trees had grown wild around it. The iron gate was rusted open, and the sign had rotted off long ago. I'd gone out there once as a teenager with some friends, mostly just to drink and scare each other with dumb stories, but I remembered it being quiet, dead silent, and I wanted that, just to get away from my own head. I packed light. A secondhand army surplus tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a knife, a couple bottles of water, a pack of jerky, and some trail mix. I left my phone in the glove box. I didn't even bring a lighter. I wasn't planning to make a fire. I didn't want light. I just wanted to disappear into the dark for a while. I told myself I was trying to reset my brain or some crap like that, but in truth, I just wanted to feel something, even if it was fear or discomfort. I got to the cemetery around 6:45 p.m. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. Everything was gold and orange, and there was that smell of cold leaves and damp dirt in the air. I parked off the road a bit, dragged my pack over my shoulder, and walked through the gate. The metal creaked like a scream as it shifted behind me. Right away, I noticed how still it was. No birds, no bugs, not even wind. It was like the air had gone heavy. The cemetery wasn't huge, maybe 2 acres if you included the overgrown parts, but it was surrounded by dense trees on all sides. Most of the stones were old and crumbling, leaning at odd angles. Some had sunken into the ground, and others had vines wrapped around them like the forest was trying to pull them under. I walked around for a while, looking at names I didn't recognize. There was a Henry Whitmore born in 1832, died in 1889. A Mary June Abbott, age 6, died in 1877. Lots of people who hadn't lived very long. I didn't feel scared at first, just sad, like this was a place time had forgotten. I found a small flat clearing near the back, beside a broken fence post and 2 tall stones sunk knee-deep in moss. I set up my tent there. It was just enough space to lay down and stretch out, nothing fancy. I didn't bother clearing the leaves underneath. I zipped up the flap, pulled my sleeping bag inside, and stretched out with my hands behind my head, staring up at the thin strip of sky between the trees. It got dark fast, the kind of dark that feels like a blanket over your face. I laid there for a long time just listening. I could hear the occasional groan of a tree limb shifting, or the whisper of something moving through leaves, but it didn't feel threatening, just normal forest sounds. Still, the longer I stayed, the more I felt this weird itch in my skin, like my body knew something my brain didn't. I kept hearing what I thought was breathing, slow, shallow, but every time I held my breath to listen, it stopped. Maybe it was just the wind. I didn't sleep much that night. I dozed off here and there, but every little noise woke me up. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching through leaves outside the tent. Not animals, 2 legs, steady steps. They circled once, then stopped. I froze in my bag, heart pounding, gripping the handle of my knife like it was going to save me from anything. I waited maybe 20 minutes before I even dared to breathe hard again. I never unzipped the tent to look. By sunrise, I was stiff, exhausted, and jumpy. The early morning mist clung to the graves like smoke. I stood up, stretched, and pissed near a tree. That's when I saw something that made my stomach knot. There were boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were wider and deeper, like someone heavier had been walking around the tent during the night. I counted 5, maybe 6 prints in a rough half circle. No tire tracks nearby, no signs of a vehicle. Just prints, leading back toward the trees and vanishing into the underbrush. I told myself it was a hunter, someone wandering through the woods. Maybe they saw the tent and walked around it to check it out, then left. But it didn't feel right. Nobody hunts that close to a cemetery, not that deep in, and not on foot with no gear. I should have packed up and left then, but I didn't. That part of me that came out here to feel something convinced me to stay another night. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. I ate a few handfuls of trail mix, drank some water, and walked the grounds for a while to clear my head. I found an old iron bench half swallowed by vines and sat there for hours just watching the woods. I thought I saw someone once, far off between 2 trees, but when I blinked, they were gone. That second night was colder. My breath came out in clouds. I bundled deeper into the sleeping bag and kept the knife beside me. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard something again. A snap, then 2 fast steps, then silence. I didn't move. More time passed. Then I heard breathing. Closer this time, just outside the tent wall. I could see the fabric move slightly inward like someone leaned their face near it. I almost screamed, but I stayed still. I waited, not sure if it was real, not sure if I was losing it. After maybe 30 seconds, the pressure vanished. Then the footsteps walked slowly away, too slow to be someone just passing through. It was like they wanted me to hear. At dawn, I opened the tent slowly. More prints. This time they went all the way around the tent in a full circle. I was done. I packed up, hands shaking. My gear was covered in frost and my toes were numb. As I rolled the tent, I noticed something scratched into one of the gravestones near where I slept. It wasn't there before. It just said, "Move." The letters were carved in messy lines, not old chisel marks. These were fresh, still sharp-edged. I stared at it for a long time, then turned and left. Didn't even eat. I walked back to the car, not bothering to check behind me. Just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. On the way out, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a thin wire tied between two trees about chest high, stretched across the narrow path that led out of the cemetery. Could have caught someone walking through at night. Maybe that someone was supposed to be me. I ducked under it, heart pounding. Then I kept driving until the trees disappeared in the mirror. I didn't tell anyone about it. What was I gonna say? Hey, I camped in a cemetery alone and someone tried to mess with me? People would just think I was drunk or lying. I knew what I saw. I still don't know who it was or why they were out there. But it wasn't some ghost story. It wasn't a haunted graveyard or any kind of supernatural thing. It was someone real, watching, waiting, and they didn't want me there. I never went back. It was a last-minute decision to go camping, really. A team-building exercise, a chance to get away from the office, and my boss, Peter, had insisted we take it seriously. I didn't mind at first, figured it would be a chance to unwind a little. Little did I know, the weekend would become something I'd never forget. We set off on a Thursday evening. The drive was smooth at first, and the trees were thick on either side of the highway, like the woods were swallowing us whole. Peter had picked the spot, a campsite in the northern part of the state, nestled deep in the forest. Somewhere quiet, he'd said, isolated, perfect for thinking, for getting away from the distractions of life. I wasn't too keen on the isolated part. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me, but I pushed it aside. I figured it was just a weekend getaway, right? We arrived after nightfall, the air thick with moisture from the rain that had fallen earlier. The forest was dense, and the faint sound of a creek bubbling somewhere nearby was the only real noise. It was peaceful, I'll give it that, but something about it felt off, like the woods had been waiting for us. Peter had packed everything we would need: a tent, sleeping bags, food, and a camp stove. He was prepared, more so than I'd expected. Felt a little excessive, but we had everything we needed. We set up camp with the headlights of Peter's truck illuminating the area, cutting through the darkness. The tent went up quickly, and once it was in place, we both started a small fire to cook dinner. Peter was talking about work, non-stop as usual, while I tried to pay attention to the crackling of the fire, the smell of the food filling the cool night air. It felt nice to sit down for once and not think about spreadsheets or meetings. We ate our dinner under the dim glow of the fire, and then, when it started to get late, we retreated to the tent. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still damp. I could hear the sounds of the woods around us, things shifting in the dark. I was too tired to care much. Peter, however, kept checking the perimeter, staring into the trees with an intensity that made me uneasy. It wasn't something I could put my finger on, but there was something about him that night, something different. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard the first noise. It was a crack, a twig snapping in the distance, followed by another. Then silence. I froze. I didn't want to wake Peter. Could have been an animal or a bird, something small. But the stillness that followed was too complete. A chill ran through me. I lay still, straining to hear anything else. The crackling of the fire was still faintly audible from outside, but the woods were otherwise silent. Another crack, this time closer. It was followed by a strange, low sound, something between a grunt and a growl. My heart rate picked up. I turned my head to glance at Peter, who was now sitting up in his sleeping bag, staring out of the tent door. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Peter didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly reached over and grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding me as he pointed it toward the entrance of the tent. The light bounced around the trees for a moment before Peter clicked it off. It was dead quiet again. I didn't want to ask, but I felt I had to. "Peter, what was that noise?" He paused, looking out into the dark again. "Probably just an animal, nothing to worry about." But his voice wasn't convincing. I could hear the uncertainty in his words. I didn't feel reassured. The hours dragged on, the sounds of the forest shifting and moving. I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but it wasn't the kind of rest I was used to. I woke up several times, uneasy, feeling as though something was just outside the tent, watching. Every little noise sent me into a state of alertness, but when I checked, there was never anything there. At one point, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, just outside the tent. I could see the outline of the trees through the fabric, but the flashlight didn't reveal anything when I looked. By morning, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. Peter, on the other hand, seemed oddly fine. He moved about the campsite with his usual energy, starting up the fire again and preparing breakfast. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods around us felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but it wasn't just me. I could tell Peter wasn't fully himself either, even if he was trying to act like everything was normal. It wasn't until we decided to head out on a hike that things began to get truly strange. The forest had no trails, at least none we could see. Peter had suggested we just wander, find our own way through the woods. We started off, the forest floor thick with leaves and underbrush, the sunlight barely able to break through the canopy. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. There was no bird song, no sound of wildlife, just the occasional rustling in the distance, too far away to identify. And then I saw something. It was a figure standing motionless between the trees. Person, but they were far off, too far for me to make out any details. I froze, and Peter didn't notice at first. When I pointed it out, he glanced in the direction I was looking, but by the time his eyes followed my finger, the figure was gone. Probably just another hiker, Peter said, but I could hear the edge in his voice. He didn't sound so sure anymore. We kept walking, but now I was on edge. Every little movement in the woods seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to hide something just out of sight. We wandered deeper and deeper, but we hadn't seen anyone else. No hikers, no signs of life at all other than us. At one point, we reached a small clearing. It was quieter here, too quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the soft rustle of trees as they swayed. And that's when I noticed it. A faint, unmistakable smell, like something rotting. I could feel the bile rising in my throat as I tried not to gag. Peter didn't seem to notice, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Do you smell that?" I asked, but Peter was already looking at something else. His gaze had fixed on a spot just ahead. There, partially hidden by the trees, was a small structure. It wasn't a cabin, but something more like an old shack. The door was half open, and the windows were covered in grime. The wood was rotting, covered in moss. The building looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. Peter was already moving toward it before I could say anything. I followed reluctantly, my feet dragging through the underbrush as I tried to shake the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. The closer we got, the worse the smell became. When we reached the door, Peter swung it open with a creak. The room was dark, filled with the scent of decay. I barely managed to hold it together as my stomach churned. I looked inside, and that's when I saw it. On the floor near the corner were remnants of something large. Clothes, perhaps, torn and half covered by the rot. It wasn't something I could identify, but I knew it was wrong. Peter stepped forward, kneeling to inspect it. His expression turned to one of confusion, then disbelief. He reached down to touch something, and I backed away. "Peter, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Peter didn't seem to hear me. He was too focused on what was in front of him. That's when I heard it again, the crunching sound, the snapping of twigs, this time much closer. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of something or someone moving. "Peter, let's go now," I almost shouted, but he didn't respond. He was still kneeling there, too engrossed in whatever he was seeing. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and moving closer. I turned around. The woods were silent, but I felt the presence now. Something was out there, something that had been watching us, something that had been waiting. I don't know how I got Peter to leave that shack. I don't know how I convinced him to walk away, but we did. We left the clearing, the smell, the strange structure, and headed back toward camp. That night, as we sat around the fire, neither of us spoke much. There were no more sounds in the woods. It was eerily still, too still. We didn't even finish the food we cooked, just stared into the fire. I didn't feel safe anymore. It wasn't just the woods. It was the feeling that something was hunting us, watching us. We packed up and left early the next morning. I never did ask Peter about what we saw in that shack, and he didn't mention it either. But neither of us ever spoke about the trip again. When I think back to that weekend, I'm still not sure what happened out there. There are things I don't understand, things I can't explain. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back to those woods. Not for any reason. It was late October 2021. I was 35 years old at the time and going through one of those strange phases in life where everything felt too loud and too fast, even though nothing dramatic was happening. I had just taken a week off from my job in Kansas City, where I worked long hours for a logistics firm. I didn't have kids, wasn't married, and didn't have anyone waiting on me at home. I just needed space, a break, something quiet and still. I'd always liked camping. Not in a flashy way, no rooftop tents or shiny gear. Just a tarp, a sleeping bag, and a solid pack. I'd grown up hiking with my uncle in Missouri and Arkansas. He taught me how to start fires, build rain shelters, purify water, the works. He passed away a few years before this trip, and I think part of me was trying to feel closer to those memories. I planned a 3-night solo trip to Mark Twain National Forest, far enough away from cell towers and road noise, but close enough to feel like I could get out if something happened. I arrived on a Thursday morning, parked in a gravel pull-off that bordered one of the lesser-used trailheads. I should mention that I wasn't camping in one of those designated campgrounds with bathrooms and picnic tables. I preferred backcountry camping, off the trail, just a spot in the woods where nobody else would walk by. I hiked about 4 miles in the first day, found a small rise near a slow creek, and set up camp there. No tent, just a nylon tarp tied low over a ridgeline, staked down, with my sleeping bag and foam pad underneath. The weather report had said there might be some light rain that weekend, but nothing serious. I was prepared either way. I had dry bags, a rain jacket, and the tarp setup was good against most wind angles. That first night was peaceful. Cold, maybe in the high 30s, but quiet and still. I boiled some water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and fell asleep early. I remember hearing owls in the distance and the soft flow of the creek. Everything felt fine. Friday started off calm. I took a long hike down the ridgeline, explored a dry wash, found some deer tracks. Nothing unusual. Around 3 p.m., the sky started shifting. Thick gray clouds rolled in fast. The air felt heavier, the way it does before a storm, and the trees started making that low moaning sound as the wind moved through them. I turned back, made it to camp just after 4 and decided to stay put for the night. I reinforced the tarp with more stakes, dug a shallow trench on the uphill side to divert water, and moved my pack higher off the ground. By 6, it was already getting dark. The rain started as a light drizzle, nothing too bad, but steady. I was in my sleeping bag, under the tarp, listening to the pattern of drops against nylon and leaves. First, it was soothing, but the drizzle didn't stop. It picked up, hour by hour, turning into a cold, slapping rain by around 10. Then the wind came, not in gusts, but in long, dragging pushes that made the trees groan and the tarp flap and snap even with the guy lines pulled tight. Couldn't sleep. I wasn't scared. Not yet, just uncomfortable. I'd been in worse. I pulled the edges of the tarp down lower and wrapped my jacket around the foot of my sleeping bag to keep out splashes. I kept checking my surroundings with a small red flashlight, just out of habit. Nothing seemed wrong. Then around 11:30, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I know the sounds deer make, and raccoons, even coyotes in the distance. This wasn't like that. This was the sound of something or someone, stepping on wet leaves. Deliberate steps, not rushing, not running, just slow, steady movements somewhere behind me and to the left. Uphill, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, I guessed. I turned off my light. I just listened. The rain masked most noises, but I swear I heard another step. Then another. I thought maybe it was a deer. I told myself it was. But deer don't usually move like that, too linear. I stayed perfectly still. After a minute or so, the steps stopped. No rustling, no splashing, just stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, probably until 2 or 3 in the morning. The rain kept coming, heavier at times, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still raining. Lighter now, but everything was soaked. I boiled water for coffee and tried to warm up. My sleeping bag was damp near the edges. I thought about packing up and heading out, but part of me didn't want to give up the trip over some creepy noises. Could have been anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around noon, I went to check the trail, just to see how muddy it was, maybe plan my exit. On the way, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were boot prints, not mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots, and I could see my own tracks here and there from the day before. But these were smaller, maybe size 9 or 10 with a different tread pattern. Not deep enough to be fresh, but still clear in the mud. And they weren't on the trail, they were up the slope, maybe 40 yards from my camp, and they curved around before disappearing into thicker brush. I didn't like it. I told myself it could be a hunter, but this section was non-hunting zone during fall. Also, why walk off trail during heavy rain at night without a fire? I went back to camp fast and started packing. The problem was, the rain had soaked everything. My tarp was heavy and slick. My sleeping bag was waterlogged near the feet. Even my extra socks were damp despite being in a dry bag. Must have had a leak. I stuffed everything away and cinched down the pack. I figured I could hike out to the car and sleep there. It was about 4 miles back. Doable even in wet boots. I started the hike out just after 1 p.m. The trail was a mess, muddy and slick with runoff in the low parts. My pack felt twice as heavy. Visibility wasn't great either. The rain kept fogging up my glasses, and everything looked gray and washed out. The woods felt empty but watchful, like someone was there, just beyond the next tree. About halfway back to the car, I saw something off the trail. A blue tarp, folded, tied off with paracord, half hidden under some rhododendrons. My first thought was that someone else had been camping nearby and bailed. I kept walking. I didn't stop to check it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. About 10 minutes later, I found more prints on the trail. They weren't fresh, but definitely newer than yesterday. Same size and tread as the ones I saw by camp. They were headed in the same direction I was going, toward the parking lot. That gave me a bad feeling. I didn't want to be walking behind whoever this was. If they were waiting up ahead, I didn't like the idea, so I stepped off trail. I figured I could take the old logging path that curved around and reconnected to the lot. I'd seen it on the map and remembered where it split from the main trail. It would add maybe 20 minutes, but it felt safer, like I was avoiding something. I moved quick. The rain was lighter now but steady, and the wind hadn't let up. My boots squelched in the mud, and every now and then a tree branch creaked loud enough to make me flinch. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made it to the parking lot by 4 p.m. My SUV was there, the only car, no one else. The lot was just gravel and puddles. I checked the windows, no break-in. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there with the engine off. Then I saw the note. It was under my windshield wiper, a small piece of lined paper, folded once. I didn't see it until I turned on the wipers and the blade pushed it up into view. My heart dropped. I got out, snatched it, got back in, locked the doors again. The note had no name, no date, just 4 words written in small, neat print. Saw you. You're smart. That was it. I started the car and drove. I didn't stop, didn't look around, didn't even check my mirrors much. I just got on the highway and drove straight home. Boots still wet, pants still covered in mud. I didn't tell anyone right away. What could I even say? I didn't report it. There wasn't a crime, just a bad feeling. A note. Some footsteps. Maybe someone was squatting in the forest. Maybe they just watched hikers and never did anything. Maybe they were trying to scare people off. Or maybe they were waiting for someone who wasn't smart enough to change direction, who didn't notice the footprints, who kept walking toward them. I don't go back there anymore. I still camp sometimes, but I stay closer to known trails. I keep my phone charged and my car closer. I don't sleep without a tent and a way to lock things up. I think about that night sometimes. The way the rain felt like it was hiding everything. The way the woods went quiet when they shouldn't have. The boots in the mud. The tarp in the brush. The note under my wiper. And I think about how close I might have been to something much worse. I was lucky. I'll never know how lucky. But I was smart enough to listen to that voice in the back of my head. The one that said, turn back, go wide, don't ignore what feels wrong. And that's why I'm still here. I had always considered myself a seasoned hunter. My father had taught me everything I needed to know about survival, tracking, and patience in the wild. It was one of those things that ran deep in our family. I didn't just hunt for sport. I hunted for the experience of being alone in the woods, away from everything that crowded the mind in the real world. This trip, though, was supposed to be something different. I hadn't been out to the woods in over 2 years, and I needed the silence, the solitude. My name's Jacob. I'm 34 years old, and I work as an electrician in a small town just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The year was 2024, and I decided to take a week off and head out to the Gila Wilderness. The Gila is known for its vast, untouched stretches of wilderness and deep canyons, offering everything I was looking for. I packed my gear into my old, beat-up truck, the one my grandfather had left me. It had seen better days, but it still ran just fine. I loaded up my tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of beans, and some jerky. The plan was simple. Find a good spot, set up camp, and hunt a mule deer or two. Nothing too complicated. I wasn't interested in a trophy hunt, just a peaceful few days where I could reset my mind. The drive was long, the landscape changing from the high desert to dense forest as I moved farther into the mountains. I passed through small towns where people looked at me like I was a stranger, even though I was in my own state. The kind of looks that only the real rural locals could give, ones that made you feel like you didn't quite belong. But it didn't bother me. I had grown used to it. After about 4 hours, I found a little dirt road that seemed to lead into the wilderness. I knew the area well enough from old maps my father had passed down to me. I turned onto the road, the tires crunching on the gravel as I moved deeper into the forest. I finally reached a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It wasn't much of a spot in terms of views, but it was quiet, and that was what I was after. I unloaded my gear and set up camp quickly. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had done all the work of setting up by habit. The tent, the fire pit, and arranging my gear for easy access. It wasn't the first time I had set up camp alone in a place like this. What struck me, though, was how still everything was. There was no breeze rustling the trees, no distant birds calling out, just the deep, heavy silence of the wilderness. I didn't let it bother me. The quiet wasn't unusual, but there was something a little off about it. Maybe it was the way the silence felt thick, like it was pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. Maybe it was because the place didn't feel lived in. The only sign of wildlife I saw was a single set of tracks that looked like they belonged to a mule deer, which was exactly what I was after. I spent the first night by myself without incident. I had a small fire going, roasting a bit of jerky and sipping from a canteen of water. The stars above were bright, and the night was crisp. There was something calming about the wilderness at night, the way the darkness seemed to swallow everything. I fell asleep early, wrapped in the warmth of my sleeping bag, the crackling of the fire my only companion. But the next morning, things began to feel strange. I woke up to the sound of a twig snapping outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear moving through the trees. But as I listened, the sound didn't repeat itself. No heavy footfalls, no rustling underbrush. just that one lonely snap of a twig. I pushed it out of my mind and started my day. I had a few hours before I needed to head out hunting. The morning air was cool and crisp. I checked my rifle, made sure it was loaded, and grabbed my hunting gear. I decided to take a walk around the area to see if there were any more tracks or signs of deer. As I walked deeper into the woods, the unease that had settled in my chest the night before only grew. The trees here were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The ground was soft, and every step I took felt muffled, like the earth itself was swallowing my movements. By midday, I hadn't seen much, but I knew the deer weren't far. They always stayed hidden during the day, only moving at dusk or dawn. I decided to set up a stand by an old dead tree I had found earlier. I climbed into the tree, staying as still and quiet as I could. Hours passed. The sun began to lower in the sky, and the shadows stretched longer. But as the light began to fade, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure about 100 yards away, moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was a man, but the figure was too still, too deliberate in its movements. It wasn't moving like someone out for a walk. It wasn't moving like anything I had ever seen before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I watched it, my heart pounding, waiting to see what it would do. It paused for a moment, then crouched low in the underbrush, as if it were trying to blend into the forest. I couldn't make out any details, but something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't the way an animal would behave. It wasn't the way any hunter I had ever seen moved. My hand went instinctively to my rifle. I kept the crosshairs trained on the figure, but I didn't pull the trigger. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I didn't want to make a mistake. Stayed hidden in the brush, waiting for something. Or maybe it was watching me. The figure didn't move for hours. I kept my position, not daring to take my eyes off of it. By the time the night came, it was gone. Just like that. One moment there and the next, nothing. I stayed in the tree for a while, but when the stars began to emerge and the moon rose high in the sky, I decided to head back to camp. My heart was still racing. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I wasn't going to spend another night out there. The air had changed. The quiet felt suffocating now, heavy with something unspoken. I packed up my camp quickly. I didn't want to waste any more time. As I was about to head out, I noticed something odd. There was a trail of fresh footprints leading away from my tent, leading deeper into the forest. The tracks were large, too large to be a deer, and they seemed to be dragging. I didn't stick around to investigate. I loaded my truck and drove the hell out of there, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. As I made my way back down the narrow dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept expecting to see someone following me in the distance, or worse, hear the crunch of footsteps behind me in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the truck for a long while, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. The woods were silent now, but I knew they weren't empty. There had been something else out there with me, something that knew how to remain hidden, how to move without making a sound. I didn't know what it was, but I was sure of one thing: it wasn't human. I never went back to that place, and every time I pass through the mountains now, I can't help but feel like something is still watching me, waiting for the next time I decide to step into the woods. But for now, I'm just glad to be home, safe. The woods are no longer a place of solitude for me. There's something else, something darker, something I can't quite put into words. But I know one thing: I'll never forget the silence I heard out there, and I'll never forget what wasn't there, yet still felt like it was. I had been planning this trip for months. Pine Ridge, located deep in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, was the perfect getaway. Far from the hustle of the city, just me, my backpack, and the quiet whispers of the woods. It was mid-September, the leaves turning to that orange hue, and the weather was crisp enough to feel like autumn but not cold enough to make you want to stay inside. Perfect night to camp. I was 32, a software developer from Pittsburgh. The office grind had been wearing me thin, so I decided it was time for a break. I had always enjoyed the outdoors, though it wasn't something I got to experience often. So, I packed up my camping gear, grabbed a map, and set out. I had done a little research and found that Pine Ridge was relatively remote, with a couple of designated camping sites but not too many people around. Just what I needed for solitude. When I arrived, the parking area was mostly empty, save for one old pickup truck with a camper shell. It looked like the kind of truck that had seen better days. Weathered paint, rust around the wheels, and an old air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. I shrugged it off. I wasn't here for company. I parked my car, grabbed my gear, and started walking. Pine Ridge had this serene vibe. The trail was narrow and lined with thick pine trees, the ground covered in a bed of pine needles. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the noise of the outside world faded away, until all that was left was the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional rustling of wildlife. I had always felt at peace in nature, but this time, there was something different about it. An odd stillness in the air, like the woods were waiting for something. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt off. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected. By the time I found my campsite, the last traces of daylight were fading, and I had just enough time to set up my tent. It wasn't the most elaborate setup. A small two-person tent, a sleeping bag, a few cooking supplies, and enough food for a couple of days. I figured I'd get the fire going, have a hot meal, and enjoy the peace before hitting the sack. As I gathered some firewood from the scattered twigs and branches around the site, I noticed the other camper's truck still parked a little ways down the trail. The truck's lights were off, but something about it felt like someone was inside. I couldn't see clearly, but it seemed odd. The vehicle had been there when I arrived, and there hadn't been any other cars in the lot. I dismissed it as nothing more than a hiker who had been here for longer than me. The fire crackled to life with ease, and I sat down, staring into the flames. The light from the fire danced on the trees around me, casting strange, flickering shadows. The night air was cool, but the warmth from the fire was enough to keep me comfortable. I ate some trail mix, had a few sips of water, and watched the stars emerge as the sky darkened. It was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the woods behind me. I thought it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop. It lingered, like something was moving closer. My heart rate picked up slightly. I wasn't exactly scared, but I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. The last thing I needed was a bear rummaging through my camp. I stood up slowly and scanned the woods, but I didn't see anything. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. I sat back down, but the rustling didn't stop. It was consistent now, like someone or something was deliberately moving through the underbrush. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Still, I grabbed a large branch from the fire and stood up again, holding it out in front of me, my eyes scanning the dark edges of the woods. Nothing. I didn't know if it was the isolation or the fading light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That feeling, that gut instinct, the kind that tells you when something is wrong, was setting in. My breath caught in my throat. I kept my eyes trained on the trees, but the noise had stopped. Not a sound, just silence. The fire crackled, and I heard a branch snap off to the side. A sharp, distinct sound. My mind raced. There was something out there. I couldn't stay on edge forever. I grabbed my flashlight, aimed it toward the truck down the trail. The beam of light cut through the darkness and briefly illuminated the cabin of the truck. No movement. I scanned the area around the vehicle. Still nothing. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding and tried to settle back down. By the time I finished my meal, the night had gotten colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket by the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that clung to the air. The crackling of the fire was the only thing keeping the silence at bay. The wind had picked up, the trees creaking under its weight. It wasn't much of a breeze, but it was enough to make the branches groan. The sound of that wind made it harder to focus, as if it was carrying whispers from deep within the woods. Just as I was beginning to nod off, a faint noise broke the stillness. This time, it wasn't just rustling in the woods. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching against the forest floor, coming from a direction I hadn't noticed before. I snapped my head toward the source, but the trees were thick, and the darkness swallowed everything else. My heart started to race again. My hands began to sweat despite the cool air. I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. For a brief second, the beam of light hit something. A figure, just standing there, barely visible through the trees. I froze. It wasn't until the figure stepped out further, revealing a tall, lean man, that I realized how much danger I could be in. He wore an old jacket, a hat, and boots that looked worn. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't here for the same reason I was. This was not just a hiker. This was someone who knew the woods too well. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching me from a distance. I couldn't make out any of his features in the darkness, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. The air seemed to thicken, and I didn't dare make a sound. Then he stepped forward again, slowly, deliberately. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood up. My mind raced. Do I run? Do I stay? My instincts told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt trapped in that moment, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. He was still silent, his movement methodical, like he was waiting for me to react. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared from sight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse hammering in my ears. I should have packed up and left right then, but I couldn't shake the idea of just sitting there, waiting for the next move. It was stupid, but the decision to stay and face whatever was out there made me feel slightly in control of the situation, as if running would somehow make it worse. Eventually, the man didn't return. I didn't sleep that night, staying awake in a semi-daze, listening to every sound, watching for any movement. I didn't feel safe enough to leave, but didn't feel safe staying either. The next morning, when the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, I packed up quickly, barely taking the time to gather everything. I just wanted to get out. I made my way back to the parking lot, where the old pickup truck was still there. The vehicle was empty, and everything around it looked undisturbed. Whoever it was had disappeared. I didn't see him again. I left Pine Ridge feeling more than a little shaken, but relieved to be away from whatever had been watching me that night. It didn't matter whether it was a person or just someone looking for trouble. I wasn't going to find out. The woods had a way of making you feel small, insignificant. That night reminded me that even in the most peaceful, serene places, danger could be lurking just beyond the trees. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the thought of the man in the woods. His silence, his presence, and the uneasy feeling that clung to the air. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I'd never return to Pine Ridge again, and that was okay. Some places are better left unexplored. It was the kind of evening that seemed to pull every ounce of warmth out of the world. The late autumn air, sharp with the chill of approaching winter, bit through my jacket like tiny needles. I was alone, just me and my old, patched-up tent in the woods outside of Prescott, Arizona. A last-minute decision to take a solo trip for a few days of peace, to clear my head. I'd been going through a rough patch, work stress, relationship issues, and a lingering unease that I couldn't quite place. I thought being out here, away from everything, would help me reset. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the earth, painting the trees with an orange glow. The ground was covered in a soft, crunching carpet of fallen leaves. It looked like something out of a picture book, calm and peaceful. But there was something about the stillness that felt off, like I was intruding. The woods were too quiet. No rustling animals, no distant sounds of birds or insects, just silence. I set up my tent quickly, pulling the poles from their bag and anchoring them into the ground. The tent was a little old, but it would do. There was no one around for miles. It was just me and the trees. The fire pit was a good distance from my campsite. It was a well-worn circle of rocks, remnants of others who had camped here before. I gathered a pile of dry wood, and after a few tries managed to get the fire going. The flames flickered against the darkening sky, the warmth pushing back the cold as the night settled in. I ate a quick dinner, just some jerky and granola bars, and sat by the fire, watching the sparks rise into the air, swirling up like little dancers before disappearing. The darkness wrapped around me like a blanket, thick and heavy. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping in that something wasn't right, but it was hard. The woods felt alive, not in a good way. I shook off the thoughts, told myself I was being ridiculous, and decided to turn in for the night. After all, I was a seasoned camper. This was just a normal, quiet forest. Nothing to fear. But as I lay there in the cramped, familiar comfort of my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It wasn't like the usual noise of forest life you'd hear on a camping trip. No animals, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, the occasional crack of the firewood outside. I tried to sleep, but every tiny sound made my pulse quicken. The snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves, each noise seemed to send my heart racing. The more I tried to ignore it, the more real the sensation became. There was something out there. I told myself it was just my nerves, nothing more. But at around midnight, I couldn't stay still any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make any noise. My eyes scanned the shadows, but I saw nothing, just the flickering of the firelight at the edge of the campsite. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out into the night. I stepped outside cautiously, walking in a slow circle around my camp. Every rustling sound in the brush made my skin crawl. There was something in the air tonight, an unspoken tension that I couldn't quite place. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. I turned back to the campfire, ready to crawl back into the safety of my tent. But as I walked past the fire pit, I noticed something strange. A small, barely noticeable indentation in the dirt, just outside the ring of stones. I leaned down to inspect it. At first, I thought it was just some animal digging at the earth. But then I saw it, a footprint. It was large, much larger than my own. The toes were clearly defined, and the heel seemed almost too wide. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the dirt, tracing the edges of the print. Whoever or whatever had left it was still nearby. My heartbeat quickened. Suddenly, the sound of something heavy crashing through the brush broke the silence. I froze, flashlight gripped tightly in my hand, my breath shallow. The noise was coming from the woods, deep in the darkness. It wasn't a bear, or a deer, or anything familiar. It sounded like something large, moving fast, and with purpose. The instinct to run hit me hard, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The crash of branches continued, getting closer, and I could almost feel the weight of whatever it was moving through the trees. I turned to the direction of the noise, shining my flashlight into the black void, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was out there. But there was nothing, just more darkness, and the soft whisper of wind through the leaves. I was scared now, genuinely scared. The forest had a way of playing tricks on you at night, but I had been camping in plenty of remote spots, and I'd never felt this exposed. It wasn't just the noises. It was the feeling that something was watching me, that I was being hunted. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and zipped up my tent. Maybe it was a bad idea to camp out here after all. It was supposed to be peaceful. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen flickered. No signal. Perfect. I wasn't gonna sit around and wait for whatever that thing was to get any closer. With my heart hammering, I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my bag and taking down the tent. It was clumsy and rushed, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. By the time I was ready to go, the night had swallowed up any remaining light from the fire. It was just me, the cold, and the dark woods that seemed to stretch on forever. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I just needed to move. I took one last look at the campsite before I headed into the woods, trying not to look back too much. My legs burned as I pushed through the thick underbrush, every sound in the forest amplifying the terror gnawing at my mind. But no matter how much I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, keeping just out of sight. The trees seemed to close in around me, and before long, I couldn't tell which way I'd come from. The trail had disappeared in the dark. I was lost, but then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A slow, steady footfall behind me. My stomach dropped. I broke into a run, desperate to get away, but the sound followed. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs moving as fast as they could, but the noise was still there, gaining on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I pushed harder, the feeling of being hunted closing in. I stumbled through the brush, my feet slipping on the wet leaves, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. Finally, I broke out of the trees into a clearing. My flashlight swept over the ground, landing on something familiar, a narrow dirt road, a lifeline. I followed the road, not caring where it led, only that it was away from whatever had been chasing me. I kept going, not looking back, until I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. A truck, a vehicle, someone out here. I waved my flashlight frantically, and the truck slowed, pulling over to the side of the road. A man leaned out the window, a confused look on his face. "You lost?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. I nodded, unable to speak through the knot in my throat. He gestured for me to climb in. "Come on, get in. It's not safe out here at night." I didn't hesitate. I ran to the truck, throwing myself into the passenger seat, my heart still racing. The truck roared to life, and we drove off into the night, leaving the woods and whatever had been following me behind.